Hi, everybody, and welcome. My name is Dorothea. I'm one of the owners of Labyrinth Books in Princeton, and I'm so very glad that you all have joined us tonight for a conversation between Cass Sunstein and my good friend Eldar Shafir, who will be talking about Professor Sunstein's new book. Here it is, if you can see it. Too Much Information, Understanding What You Don't Want to Know. I will be bringing the two of them up in just a few minutes. But first, a quick thank you to the Princeton Public Library, our incredible partner for so many events during normal times and in these strange times online also, and to Janie Herman in particular, who I see has signed in from the library. We have also been collaborating for many years now with the Princeton School of International and Public Affairs, and they too are co-sponsors this evening. So thank you to Patty and everyone there. Just briefly, some housekeeping. You can order too much information from us online, and I'm just realizing that's a sentence that is probably true in so many ways. We can all order too much of everything online. But in this case, this book that you're ordering will be just the right amount of information. You should enter the promo code Sunstein to get 10% off. You can also, of course, stop by the store or pick the book up curbside if you give us a call. An email works as well. That email would go to orders.labyrinth@gmail.com. And I have put all that information up at the top of the chat, along with our phone number. It's also, of course, on labyrinthbooks.com. I'm actually going to take the chat down during the conversation, and then I will put it back up again during the Q&A. And as for the Q&A, we will be sure to leave plenty of room for your questions. And here is how to ask a question on this platform, since, as I just said, I will be taking the chat down. Please just go to the Ask a Question button that's at the bottom of the screen. And you can put your questions in the queue as you think of them during the conversation, and then we'll get to those. If you see a question already there that interests you as well, there will be a little arrow next to each question, and you can upvote something that interests you, and then we can take that into account and see that there's sort of a cumulative interest, and be sure to get to those questions first, maybe. I'm going to just make one quick request to all of you, because very often I forget to put the chat back up during the Q&A. And so if you notice that, just put the word chat in that Ask a Question button, and that will remind me. If someone could do that, that would be fantastic. So it's really an honor to have Cass Sunstein and Eldar Shafir here for this virtual event. Professor Sunstein is a legal scholar and behavioral economist teaching at Harvard. He headed the Obama administration's Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs between 2009 and 2012. He is perhaps best known for his celebrated and best-selling book, Nudge: Improving Decisions About Health, Wealth, and Happiness. Eldar Shafir, too, is a behavioral economist with a long-standing interest in decision-making. He teaches in the psychology department at Princeton University and also at the Princeton School of Public and International Affairs. And he is the author of the acclaimed book, Scarcity, The New Science of Having Less and How It Defines Our Lives, which has helped us, I think, in particularly profound ways to understand the logic at work in many decisions, especially those made by the poor. It's also been on the top 10 list at Labyrinth Books for a long, long time. You can see how the background and interests of our two speakers, which I think always also include the policy implications of their research, how those interests intersect. So I am particularly excited that the two of them can be with us. Both Professor Sunstein's time at the White House and I think his previous work on how decisions relate to our well-being have prepared his new book on when and to what extent information is good for us, and what the criteria might be for establishing guidelines for governmental policy. At every turn in this book, which is example-filled and lucidly written, he himself takes into account the heterogeneity of people and circumstances, of psychological and material factors that complicate the very metrics that he's studying and using. And so in that sense, it's a book that has a kind of self-skeptical method. And to me, that seems like it's itself a lesson in questioning our basic assumptions. In this case, the assumption first and foremost that when it comes to information, more is always more. He writes at some point, the basic question is whether information will make people better off, all things considered. And the devil is in the all things considered. So let's hear now from our guests. I'm going to bring them up onto the screen in just 1 second. Here's Eldar Shafir. Hi, Eldar. And here is Cass Sunstein. Welcome, both of you. I'm going to take myself out of the view and leave it to you guys. Welcome.
Thank you, Dorothea. Cass, welcome. It's a tremendous pleasure and an honor to spend some time with you and on this lovely new book. I think what we'll do is maybe give you 10, 15 minutes to set the stage, give us the essentials, and then we'll have a conversation, if that's good for you.
That's great. Thank you, Eldar. Thanks, everyone, for being here. So this is a really personal book. It's close to life and the human soul, it turns out, or at least this particular one. And I'll tell you a couple of tales that helped orient my thinking, at least. When I was in the White House, we were focused a lot on information disclosure as a regulatory tool. Of course, this has a lot of resonance in a time of COVID-19 when information's around, and also in the midst of a presidential election. One of our issues was whether to require calorie labels throughout the United States, and the Affordable Care Act kind of requires that for chain restaurants, but it leaves ambiguous whether the calorie label requirement can or should be applied to movie theaters. A very active discussion within the White House of that. And I was on the side of yes, include the movie theaters. And ultimately the decision came through to that effect. That was the consensus of the team. And I celebrated that fact on the day of decision, of public disclosure of the decision, by sending a note to a friend about calorie labels would be applied to movie theaters. And my friend wrote back 3 words: Cass ruined popcorn. That was deflating, but I also thought it was kind of deep that when you go to a movie theater and, you know, it might be Tenet, which I highly recommend, or Star Wars, which needs no recommendation, it is self-recommending. You don't want to think as the lights go down and you start, you know, consuming something you really like, oh my gosh, getting fat. So the notion of ruining popcorn is generally important, where people might speculate that if I get this information, my popcorn will be ruined, so I'm going to run like the hills. Or it might actually be the fact that their popcorn is ruined, and that's not the nicest thing to do, other things being equal. Okay, the second kind of motivating event is more intimate, if you'll permit. Eldar, you and I are very good friends. Not everyone in the session has become a good friend yet, but you're all going to hear something which only good friends of mine know, which is a number of years ago, actually decades ago, my dad, who was a very athletic and fit person, started stumbling on the tennis court. And my mother and I, alarmed, brought him into the hospital for testing. And after 5 or so hours of tests, my dad and I were in the hospital room. My mother came up, having talked to the doctor, and said, I have great news. The tests all came out negative. You're completely fine. They're going to keep you here overnight. for assurance, but basically clean bill of health, it's fine. And we had a celebratory lunch there in the hospital. And after that lunch, my mother brought me down to the parking lot to drive me back to actually law school. And I saw her face change in ways that only an actor can change a face. It switched basically on a dime. And I saw despair on a human face for the only time. It was despair incarnate. And she said, what I said was not true, that your father's going to die. He has a very advanced brain tumor, and there's no hope. It's going to be within a year. But I'm not going to tell him, and neither are you. That was a defining life event, yes. And of course, it's as if it was yesterday in terms of its vividness. My mother made a call, and I still am not sure if it was the right one. I tend to think so for her and my dad, where what she really didn't want to do was ruin his popcorn big time. The thought was disclosure of this particular information would produce a tombstone over his psyche that would be unmovable. And she was hoping that he would have a number of months of hope and life. And I think there was some selfishness too, earned selfishness. She wanted herself to live a life that had normality for as long as possible, and that they could have, years, well, not years, months as a couple together that would not be pervaded by what would have been, by her account, too much information. Okay, given the popcorn tale and my dad tale, I've now embarked on a research project that spans 11 countries, and that is designed to figure out what information do people want to have. And as you might expect, the theme of don't ruin popcorn is pervasive in the reaction of the human species to the question, do you want to know X, where X might involve Alzheimer's or calories or cancer or bills? And a lot of people will say, no, I don't want to know that. On the other hand, there's a lot of heterogeneity out there, and a lot of people are information grabbers, such that they really want stuff, even if it's not necessarily going to make them smile. Okay, we need a little framework for this, and the framework which emerges from the data is that there are two reasons why people want information, mostly. One is it useful? Is it something that they can do something with? And the other is, how's it going to make them feel? And the heterogeneity in the data is based on the fact that people give different weights to these two factors, usefulness and emotional impact, and that people react differently and reasonably with respect to the usefulness and the emotional impact of the thing. So if someone is at risk of cancer, let's say, they might think, not unreasonably, let's say, if I find out that I'm at serious risk of cancer, I maybe can do something about it. I really want to know that. Other people will think, given my situation, probably there's not a lot I can do. Maybe I'm old and very sick anyhow. And some people will think the emotional effect will be devastating to me. And the fact that it might be useful is basically a footnote to the devastation. And others will think I can handle it. So that kind of rational account of information seeking and information avoidance explains a lot of the territory. But as Eldar, you are one of the world's leading experts on this and know that there are some distortions that are going to come into play where some people will think, you know what, today matters and tomorrow, next decade, that's a foreign country, later land, and I think I'm not going to visit. So it's going to make me sad today and save my life in 2020. Don't tell me. I'll avoid the long-term relevant information because the short-term emotional impact is the only thing I care about. That's me. So if people focus on the short term, they may show information avoidance in circumstances in which possibly they shouldn't. It's also the case that many people are unrealistically optimistic, which, let's say, can lead them to be information avoidant or non-information seeking in circumstances in which it can be very useful for them to be information seeking. Optimistic bias can cut both ways with respect to information avoidance and information seeking. Okay, if we want to understand mental health issues, depression and anxiety, understanding information avoidance and information seeking can be a way in. It's not all of the picture, but it helps explain both behavior and, let's say, aggravating factors with respect to depression and anxiety. And if we want to understand policy, we're now, I think, in a position to get better traction than I at least was able to do in my time in government, because we have a sense of the benefits and costs, the welfare effects of information that outstrips the general idea, which is, more is better. So sometimes more isn't better, or for some populations, more might not be better, when the effect might be to make them sad and not alter their behavior. For other populations, more is crazy better, and the emotional impact isn't negative. So now we have a bright future, I think, for policymaking. I'm going to add just one point before I close, which is that Eldar, as I hope most of you know, has done transformative work on the topic of scarcity, meaning not just, or not basically economic not having, but cognitive scarcity. And the government is often both giving out and seeking information from people in a way that very much bears on the scarcity problem and is deeply illuminated by it. So sometimes information provision is not helpful because people have limited bandwidth, and it is basically just a whirring noise in the background. And when government seeks information from people to the tune of 11 billion hours of paperwork burdens, that's the latest number, give or take a few hundred million, 11 billion, it is taxing people's bandwidth in a way that can make them unable to get healthcare, a visa, economic assistance, educational opportunity, a job, a permit, a license. For normal, rational actors, that 11 billion hours turned into a human reality for, let's say, a would-be visitor from Ghana, or turned into a human reality for a would-be Princeton student from Ohio, that can prove devastating, not just because it's a time tax, but because the time tax is effectively a brick wall in front of a human being. To reduce this thing, let's call it sludge, is a moral imperative. It's not part of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but it ought to be. Too much information is often acquired by private and public institutions because of its impact on the people whom those institutions are designed to serve. We need sludge audits. We need sludge reduction, because that's a first step toward giving members of the human species the one thing that we are most blessed to have. This is not a Hallmark card, but the one thing that human beings are most blessed to have, I assert, don't argue. It is a four-letter word, and it's not love. It's time. Thanks.
Thank you, Cass. The book reads Morality Conversation with a really thoughtful person that goes into very many directions. I try to pick a few that seemed interesting to me, and let's try them. And of course, feel free to deflect if there's something you want to talk about more. But one thing that comes up that I thought was really interesting is the notion that people want disclosure of information in which they have no interest. And I found that really interesting. In some sense, although it sounds like a paradox, it makes perfect sense. So, I wouldn't pay you a cent right now to know about the temperature in Madrid or the occurrence of COVID in Ohio, but it's important for me to have it available if tomorrow I decide to go there. How do you think about that sort of information? There's a distinction between information that you put in my face, that you send to me in a text, and information that's just hanging in the cloud where I can reach it when I need.
Okay, you might think that information is like an option. So you might pay something to have an option to get a car or invest in something or have a vacation, even if you're not going to do those things. So a deposit sometimes in ordinary life, for those of us who don't really understand stock markets very well, a deposit is like an option.
Me too.
And you can think of it information as like an option. So to have information available that you can use if it turns out to be relevant to something in your life, might be something that you'd be thrilled about or even be willing to pay for. So to have information available to you in the form of Wikipedia might be something you'd be willing to pay for, even with respect to entries that you have no interest in today and won't have interest in by your expectation ever, but it's possible. And that's something that you might think is worth having.
Which is related to another issue you raised, which I thought was extremely interesting from a behavioral perspective. It's all the information that's neither instrumental nor effective. It's just the information that makes me a richer human being. When I read about the Middle Ages or about, the Rwandan genocide, it doesn't make me happy. I'm not sure how I'm going to use it, but it feels like, important stuff to have and to know.
Yes, I'll tell you the genesis of this point. So in the remarks, I emphasized the instrumental value and the emotional value, but clearly that's not exhaustive. So I did a paper with a neuroscientist, Tali Sharat, and we were struggling with the category you're now describing. And both of us had an intuition that there's something going on in people's information seeking, which isn't about usefulness or about emotional impact. And we had a very hard time describing it because the word curiosity might be not the driver, but might be kind of the product of the driver, but it's not basic curiosity, we think. So the way we made progress with it was an example. I said, aren't you really curious to know the exact relationship between dogs and wolves? Wouldn't you care to know that? And she said, no, not at all. She has absolutely no interest in that. And I was stunned. Of course, you're interested in that, Eldar. Yes, the relationship.
Of course.
But the fact that there's diversity on that goes to exactly your point, that whether knowing the relationship between dogs and wolves makes for a richer life, we can bracket that one. But there's a lot of stuff that does, like whether Shakespeare actually wrote Shakespeare's plays, or something about the structure of the universe, which isn't relevant to your behavior, but makes you feel fuller and like your life is more, the word rich is a little cliche, but it's basically the truth, not money rich, but mental rich. So a lot of stuff we care to know and we seek out it's cognitive value. It's how it relates to our picture of the world. And we want that picture to be, I guess, as interesting and full and accurate as possible. That's a little too crude but it's in the ballpark. The reason it's too crude, I'm thinking, is that there's a lot of things that would make our mental picture very full, that it would be like a plate that's got too many items on it.
Yeah.
Number of hair on the head of everyone in my neighborhood. I'm not interested in that, and not because it would put me to shame, just because it's not a very interesting fact. It's like too many things on the plate.
Well, in your neighborhood, maybe it would make you proud. You're not sure.
I'm not sure, but it showed you.
Let's get a bit more in the fine grain. So a major issue when you take the perspective of regulatory considerations from the government is the cost-benefit analyses. And you have written a lot about cost-benefit analyses. It plays an important set of issues that come up in the book. But you present a very innocent perspective, like there is a scientific calculation there. But as you, at some point, bring up, the social cost of carbon was $40 under Obama, and it's $6 under Trump. The value of a human life went from $3.5 billion, I think, under Bush to over $6 under the early Obama. So I'm thinking from the perspective of the recipient of the government calculations. Doesn't it make popcorn even worse if it's 200 calories one day and 3,000 the next?
Okay, so I'm sure I'm too something about this, too optimistic or something. But let's talk about the social cost of carbon and then the value of life, and then talk about information. So the social cost of carbon is the number capturing the amount of damage done by a ton of carbon emissions. And you might think that there's something fanciful or impossible about that, but there are actually models, one of which produced the Nobel Prize for William Nordhaus at Yale, one of which is in Germany, one of which is in London. And those are the three long-standing models. And they try to do this. And they're, as good as we've got. And if you average them, a number is spat out. That's too simple, but it's really close. And the number is 40, which Obama used. Trump went down to about 6, and the difference turned on one thing only. This is too simple, but very close to not too simple, which is Trump used the domestic cost and Obama used the global cost. So they both use the three models. And Obama said, if the United States causes an emission that hurts China and France and Italy, we're going to take that on board. That's the damage. And Trump said, no, just the American damage. And that accounts for the vast majority of the difference between the 40 and the 6. Now, what's beautiful about that is that they're not disagreeing on anything scientific. They're just disagreeing about the population harmed that's relevant to US policymaking. And we could explore who's right and why. But in terms of the damage done by carbon, startlingly, the Trump administration and Obama administration, who would have thought, are in the technical analysis on the same page. Now, the current value of a statistical life is approximately $10 million. And that's because the best peer-reviewed papers, which are trying to assess how much do people have to be paid to face a mortality risk of, let's say, 1 in 10,000 or 1 in 100,000, how much do they get? And there's a lot of uncertainty in these papers, and there are a lot of criticisms that are plausible to make of these papers. But that's basically the best we've got. And the Obama switch from Bush was basically just to update based on where the peer-reviewed literature was. It wasn't that the Obama people thought we care more about workers than the Bush people did, though maybe the Obama people did also do that. But the number was based on the peer-reviewed studies, and the Trump people are with the Obama people because that's where the peer-reviewed studies are. Now, if the Trump people had cut the Obama number, let's say from 10 million to 5 million, there would have been some explaining to do. And it's kind of hard to figure out what that explaining would look like. There aren't analyses that justify a $5 million figure that are credible. Maybe they would have had to do their own analysis. It would have been very vulnerable in court, which may be one reason it's not down. Now, the social cost of carbon is really hard to come out with a number. The value of statistical life is also really hard. Information, it's harder still.
Yep.
So how much do you value a graphic warning for cigarettes, as the government now is mandating? Or how much do you value a calorie label? And the book really struggles with how to think about that. I'm confessing now, the book struggles. The book doesn't say, here's the way to do it, hooray, hooray. The reason it's hard is what economists would like to work with is people's willingness to pay for information. And you might ask, how much are people willing to pay for calorie labels, which has a, it has a kind of humility to it. Like, how much are people willing to pay for soap? You don't want to force them to buy soap they're not willing to pay for. Why should you force them to have information that they're not willing to pay for? Now, put to one side the fact that poor people don't have much money. That's important. And there are things that we might want to do given that fact. But let's just say we're trying to figure out what people want. And that's what the government's trying to do. But if people lack information, then how much credit should we give for their willingness to pay for information which they don't have?
So, Tess, let me push you on a little bit here. So, everything you just said, only you and maybe Nordhaus know.
Mm-hmm.
I'm taking the perspective of the American who's going to buy popcorn to go into the theater. And there, okay, Trump is looking domestic, Obama is looking international. The fact is, I'm getting numbers that are massively inconsistent. Furthermore, I walk around with a strong suspicion that regulators are more beholden to the industries they regulate than to my well-being, which also you would largely kindly avoid the politics, but I think for an American, that's a major issue. And finally, while we're talking about willingness to pay, there is, of course, you beautifully review some of the tensions, but there's another one that's kind of interesting, which is, what we call extension neglect. So if you ask me how much would I pay to regulate so that American companies don't sell expired food in Nigeria, I say X dollars. And if you ask me how much would I pay to regulate American companies that sell expired baby food in Ghana, I also say X dollars, except Nigeria is, 7 or 8 times bigger than Ghana. And I've shown no sensitivity there at all. So there was these issues that have to do both with my sensitivity and my distrust of the regulator, which make things even more complicated than they come up in your book.
No, I agree. So, okay, so we'll do a second edition and talk about that. So in the end, the title of the book is Too Much Information.
Yeah.
I was so focused on not having a reviewer say, gosh, he added too much information. So that's why I didn't talk about the good issues you're raising.
Yeah.
No, that's not why I didn't. But
no, that's fair. No, you covered a lot.
Let's talk about the issue of the American public and how to deal with it. I completely agree with you that to use the standard economic measure of willingness to pay is a rabbit hole, and for multiple reasons. And so it may not be the most exciting thing to say that I've concluded a self-evidently absurd approach to this problem is indeed absurd, but that is one of the conclusions of the book. So then what do we do? So suppose you're in government and you're trying to figure out, should we go forward with a calorie label, or should we go forward with labeling genetically modified food, or what should we put on a sunscreen label, or what should we tell people about anything under the sun? How do we design mortgage disclosures or credit card disclosures? Okay, here's a way that doesn't involve willingness to pay. How much benefit are you going to get in terms of something you care about from the disclosure? Meaning, is a graphic warning for cigarettes, is that going to save lives? How many can you project? Maybe you can't project, 7,000 lives. Can you say the lower bound is this and the upper bound is that? If you are going to require disclosure of calorie labels, what are the health benefits you're going to get? How many people are not going to get diabetes or heart attacks as a result? Now, the people whose job it is to figure this stuff out, there are 3 possibilities. One is they will figure it out and they'll tell you. Another is they'll say, we just don't have the data, we don't know. A third is they'll say, well, we know the worst case and the best case scenario for this, so we can tell you that. Now, either of those answers is really helpful. In the first case, then you can use the machinery, say, look, this is going to be a pretty costly mandate, but you're going to save this many lives, and that's a big number. And it would be kind of crazy to think that that number doesn't justify the expenditure, given that we have a number for saving a statistical life, which is 10 million. And then that makes a lot of people queasy, but whatever number you like, plug it in. If it isn't 0 or the GDP, then you're on the road at least to having a non-crazy analysis of whether to do it. And if the scientists say you have this disclosure, it's not going to help anybody. It's only going to confuse and scare them.
Yep.
And now you're cooking. And that's better than where I think any country is right now, though the United States is in this direction at its best, meaning the United States at its best is thinking for calorie labels. And I think this is one reason the Trump administration didn't back off the Obama administration idea, is it thought, we're going to get a lot of benefits, health benefits from this, we think, and it's not that expensive. By contrast, the Trump administration is kind of required by law to label genetically modified food, and it candidly confessed, if you read the fine print, we're not going to get any benefits from this. It's not going to help anybody's health. It's not going to do anything environmentally good, but we have to. Now, that's in the interest of transparency, to know Congress required something that at first glance is going to increase costs, hurt companies, hurt consumers a little bit, and not help health. That's a big contrast from the calorie label requirement.
Good. That's good. Fair enough. Let me take you a little bit larger picture. You never claim to solve this problem. This is a separate problem, but I'm just worried. Are you concerned a bit that information, in some sense, the provision of information, provides an excuse for irresponsible regulators or policymakers? So let me give you an example. We have right now, I think the estimate is about 46 to 48 million Americans below the poverty line, probably 100 million below the living wage. About half the nation provides unregulated payday loans. We know what payday loans do. There's evidence, there's research. When I need money not to get evicted, I go and get a payday loan. You can provide information, tell me what the APR is, how much it's going to cost me. It doesn't do bupkis because I need the money right now. And instead of making sure that I have easy loans available for cheap, you unregulate the loans and give me the information. That seems to me a major concern if that's seen as a venue for getting out of it with some apparent responsibility.
I'm a little stuck on the word butkus because I lived in Chicago for a long time. Well, this was after Dick Butkus's heyday. Dick Butkus was the greatest football player on the defensive or offensive.
Not the guy I meant.
Okay, so that's not what you meant. So there is a trope out there or something which George Lowenstein has popularized, which is that information disclosure as a remedy actually has a pernicious effect in discouraging more aggressive regulation. I don't believe it. Meaning, as a first approximation, I don't believe it's ever happened. As a more refined approach, it might have happened epsilon times. So we have in numerous countries energy efficiency disclosure requirements, which are added to energy efficiency mandates. So refrigerators have to have a degree of energy efficiency, same through of microwave ovens. There's also disclosure. If you buy a car in the United States, there's fuel economy rules. They're pretty aggressive. They should be more aggressive than they are. There's also labels. I've worked in the government for 4 years, and I've had close contact with the government since I left, including with former colleagues in the Trump administration. I never heard anyone say, even once, in the context of, let's say, approximately 5,000 rules, let's do information instead of a mandate in circumstances in which we would do the mandate if not for the information. People would often say, let's do the information and the mandate, or would say the mandate's dumb, let's do information. But the idea that a mandate might be smart, but let's not do it because of the information, I never saw it happen. And as I say, as a first approximation, I don't believe it's ever happened, but maybe to be a little more responsible, maybe of the 5,000 rules I've had some acquaintance with, I think 0, but maybe 2.
But so, I want to understand what you're saying, Kes, because let's make it a little bit less diabolical. It's not intentional. So you talk a bit about the weight that comes with 75-page documents that I cannot decipher. You went out of your way as a czar under Obama to facilitate all that. But also as a legal eagle, you'll agree that's unavoidable. We're never going to have a half a page for my mortgage agreement. Now, in some sense, that's information that's given to me under the assumption that if I do the responsible stuff, I'll have the right mortgage. And it seems to me, implicitly or explicitly, absolves the need to get rid of ballooning mortgages because it's my responsibility to decipher the contract correctly. Now, you and I both signed a contract that we never read and didn't understand because we could rely on who's giving it to us. But many Americans got one that balloons. And it seems to me, even if it's not explicitly stated, that absolves people of the responsibility to provide a context that's safer.
It's possible, but I'm being a little more skeptical based on experience than I should be. We'd want data. So let's take the hypothesis to be that the availability of a disclosure remedy relieves the pressure for more aggressive intervention. And that can't be ruled out of bounds. I just can report I never saw it. Not only did I never see it, I never saw anyone even raise it once. And here's an analog. There's tort law, which makes assault and theft tortious. And would it be right to say that because assault and theft are tortious, we don't criminalize assault and theft? If someone rapes someone, the victim can sue the rapist for damages, big time damages. Would we say that that therefore we don't observe rape being criminalized? That's not what we observe. And it's, I think, equally plausible to say the existence of the tort law imposes a kind of moral opprobrium that fuels the enactment or invocation of the criminal law. So to the existence of, let's say, cigarette warnings or fuel efficiency warnings can energize public about the importance of the relevant values that can ultimately spur the mandates. That I did observe, by the way, that discussion of fuel economy and disclosure of things with respect to sunscreen, if it's too low, the whatevers, that it's not going to help you from cancer. It might help you get it from burn, but not cancer. I did observe that discussion of disclosure as a remedy sometimes put on the table at least the discussion of a mandate. Not discussion took off the table what would have been a discussion. I agree with you that intuition suggests that the availability of the weaker could diminish the appeal of the stronger. But I think of all the things we have in the world to worry about, that would be maybe at the bottom of the list.
Okay, we have a different list, but we'll talk about it sometime. What connected to this, one last thought. You talk about the good news that, you know, with future technology, we could have more personalized and targeted disclosures. And again, going back to the full circle here, it seems to me that along the same lines, we'll also have a lot more personalized data about people. And we know now that banks give me a mortgage which they know I will not be able to pay, and I happily take it. So that good news goes both ways. And it's back again, I worry a bit about leaving me to fend for myself with all the information, whereas in fact I might need more defenses than are available.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. So let's talk about the good side and then the less good side. So if people want information bearing on something, let's say they have a peanut allergy and they really want to know everything peanut related about the food supply. They, in the fullness of time, and we're getting there, can figure that out. I have a seafood allergy, and the informational system is much more rich and personalizable given that fact than it used to be. Not only about health things, about curiosity and moral values. So if you really care about something about your food for moral reasons, you can find that out, and that's a positive. I agree with you that personalized pricing and exploitation of people is also easier, and that's because of information acquisition on the part of people who are doing stuff. And there's a very nice paper by Oren Bar-Gil that shows that personalized pricing can have very bad effects with behaviorally biased consumers, and that's definitely a problem.
Cass, this is wonderful. At the rate you write books, I hope we'll meet again in a couple of months for the next one. We'll talk about that soon. It was a total pleasure, and I think Dorothea will take over to do some questions from the audience.
Yes, I will. Thank you for this conversation. I've really enjoyed the sort of toggling between the uses and abuses of information in your guys' conversation. I want to encourage all of you again just to put questions under the Ask a Question button, and I will field them from there. And we have time, so by all means, add things there. The first question that I see here is an interesting one that deals, that sort of centers on the question of equality and access to information. And let me just let me just read to you this question. Technology activists often quote Stuart Brand's infamous line, "Information wants to be free," but proprietary databases and paywalls often means that information is expensive. Access to this expensive information, which is usually quality information, creates an unjust barrier. Do you envision a time in the future that information will truly be free, or will it always be that the best information is reserved for those with means of access? So a question about access and equality.
What a great question. So, and I don't have a great answer. I have like pieces of an answer. So there's Wikipedia, which is free. Many things on the internet, many information sources are free. The New York Times isn't, but CNN is. So there are lots of things that people without means can get access to that they couldn't formerly. As a first entry, I feel very optimistic about not information wants to be free. I don't even know what that means, but the idea that in an online world, there's just a lot of stuff that you don't have to pay for to get. And what the economic model is such that people are giving that information, it's highly variable, but some of it is public pressure. So the notion that papers that Eldar writes and that bear on, the world are going to be open access, that's clearly coming, and that means anyone can get them. And so I do feel that the inequalities of, let's say, 1930 with respect to information acquisition are in many domains reduced or eliminated, but I'm sure there are areas where that's not true, and that's a public policy challenge.
Yeah, I feel like there's an underlying optimism that kind of buoys your book, and which makes it a sort of extra pleasure to read, and I see that in your answer here. Let's move to the next question in the queue, which brings us more into our contemporary moment of fake news, where Nick is wanting to know, thanking you first for this great talk, how the deliberate misuse of information enters into the calculation of whether or how much information to release. And so the associated question would be, should policymakers be thinking maybe in, for instance, game theoretic ways of how to release information if it can be misused, or should they just stay above this?
Okay, that's also very good. So you might think, as a former government person, we did about if we disclose information, will it be countered by false information such that it will be less effective than we anticipated? And what would we do about that, which is game theoretic? Or are there restrictions to be imposed on, let's say, commercial speech, which is either fraudulent or manipulative? And I think we need to think a lot about the category of manipulative. Eldar has a great paper on this, that there ought to be something like a right not to be manipulated. I think that there's an old paper, one of the greatest law review papers of all time, called The Right to Privacy. Justice Brandeis was a co-author, and it defined a right to privacy. We need some paper like that. If someone on this call, the session, would write that paper, I'd be very grateful, and I'd be willing to pay a lot for a paper on right not to be manipulated. On misinformation generally, of course, this is in the news, and rightly so, that Facebook and Twitter are not doing an adequate job of controlling the misuse of their platforms to destroy people's reputations, sometimes their lives, to adversely affect their health and safety, and to undermine, possibly worse, our democracy. And this often comes from deliberate misinformation. And the free speech tradition is maybe the most precious thing we've got, but traditions sometimes have to be rethought given new circumstances.
Yeah.
Not less free speech, but what are the defining ideals, and how do they apply in unanticipated circumstances?
Yeah. While we see if there's another question from the audience, maybe I'll follow up with a quick question on my own, since you mentioned social media, and in the book you do discuss social media also. And so my question would be how the willingness to pay measure, which features really prominently as a methodology, and you complicated in the book too, when it comes to social media, how you would factor in the fact that there's an addiction that is well studied now. So when we try to assess what we're willing to pay and how valuable the information on social media is to us, how can that be parsed given the fact that that addiction is at play in our use of that particular information?
I think you're exactly right. And that confounds the use of the willingness to pay number. So I'll tell you, I have a lot of data of my own about how much people are willing to pay to use social media and how much they would demand to give up use of social media. But I confess the data in the book that I like best is not my own. And what it shows is that people are demanding, let's say, $100 to get off Facebook for a month. And after that month, by every measure of how their life is going, they're doing better. They're happier, they're more satisfied with their life, they're less anxious, they're less depressed. Every measure, that was a good month. And then they're asked, how much would you be paid now to give up Facebook for another month? Now, given what I just described, they would say, how much would I demand? I'll pay you. I don't want this crap. But instead, what they say is $87. So they give a number that's 13% lower than the original 100. Now, there's a puzzle there. Why are they demanding $87 to be depressed and anxious? And one possibility, which the authors of the paper are intrigued by, and I think they kind of like, is that people care about things other than their emotional state. So they want to connect with their friends and see pictures of babies and hear about how the world is falling apart, even if it makes them sad. And that is possible. But the competing hypothesis builds on your point about addiction and also says that people are just making a mistake. They're not taking on board the adverse effects on their days of being on social media so much. I think that's probably the right explanation.
Yeah, there's a question in the queue that kind of follows up and connects with this, and it's addressed to both of you. So that might be a nice question to wrap up on, which is the question of information overload, and which we all experience, and it's demonstrated mental health effects. And the question here from the audience is what do you recommend? So how do we defend against information overload without taking ourselves out of the loop for information we do need?
Cass, you go.
Thanks, pal. Hard question.
I feel overloaded.
So for an information provider, let's say it's a bank or an automobile company or a teacher or the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, it's really important to keep this in mind if you're trying to keep people safe or trying to help them understand their products. To throw pages and pages at them might make them feel disempowered and scared and not get them in a better position to make good choices. So that's that. For each of us, I think to think in some self-conscious way, are we gaining from this experience of reading whatever we're reading? And if you ask that question too often, you're going to drive yourself in circles. But to ask it occasionally with respect to your information diet is a good idea. And some people should be on an information diet, certainly with respect to some things which are basically just baffling and disempowering.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think one thing that's interesting to me is that we all know it, but it's not intuitively immediately accessible to us. So we know it's not good to be on the phone while we drive, but all of us are on the phone while we drive. I don't mean handheld, no hands held, still very dangerous. And we all know we should probably leave the iPhone outside the bedroom in the evening, but we end up taking it because we think we'll be okay with it. And so it's one of those challenges where even knowing is not enough. You really need you need a regulator to forbid it to help us.
Or an architecture in your own life.
That's
so
right.
a little bit, you can design I have a refrigerator in the room from which I'm speaking, which is an upstairs refrigerator, and it basically has no food in it, none. It has water, and that's a self. It's an architecture. And downstairs, the bigger refrigerator has stuff, but we used to have a lot of Oreo cookies, and we now have no Oreo cookies.
I thought you were going to say put the iPhone in the refrigerator at night.
No, the iPhone stays, but I like your point about, too much information coming from that precious family member called iPhone.
You know that they sell these jars now, Dorothea, where you can literally put all the phones and lock it with a timer. So over dinner, there's literally no way to access the phone for an hour or whatever, just so you can talk to each other.
That's right. That's right. Well, we've been talking with each other without iPhones for an hour, and it's been fabulous. I myself am on an information diet when it comes to polls. So I think there are a lot of dimensions in this book that relate to our current moment that will make us all think about the information that is useful to us, makes us happier or not, and provokes us just to think more, as all the best books do. So with that, I want to thank both of you again for your time. I want to thank all of you for tuning in. I encourage you to pick up Cass Sunstein's wonderful book. And I always say on these calls that one of the great things is that people can tune in from anywhere. And while I would love for you to buy your book at 10% off from Labyrinth, the most important thing is that you buy it from a local independent bookstore. So go to whichever store is nearest and dearest to you and support that store. And with that, I just wish all of you a good night and be well. Take care. And thanks, Eldar, and thanks, Cass. It's been great.
Fabulous book, Cass.
Yes.
Thanks so much.
Bye, all. Take care.
See you. Thanks.
Wonderful.